Hi, hello. Welcome to episode 5 of our Borderlands journey. Well, here we are, still sitting down in the sunshine outside the west door of the Priory Church of St. Peter and St. Paul in Leominster, just where we said goodbye to each other at the end of our last episode. And now contemplating our journey back through the town and onwards to the lovely village of Dilwyn. But first, let's have a closer look at this impressive building, impressively ancient too. Back in the early days of English Christianity, the religion was spread into the pagan heartlands of central England by holy men from the deep west, from the Celtic Church in Wales and from the Western Isles of Scotland. And this church here in Leominster was founded by St. Eadfrith in the year 660. He was a monk from Lindisfarne in the far north of England, whose training had been with the great St. Columba on the holy island of Iona, far out in the Western Isles. Eadfrith travelled alone and on foot from distant Northumbria to convert the pagan King Merewelch of the kingdom of the Hoiche, a land squeezed in between Mercia to the east and the Celtic British kingdoms to the west. After many weeks of walking, Eadfrith came to a little patch of land surrounded by marshes, and he sat down to rest and eat his meal when he saw a lion prowling towards him. Even though he was afraid, rather than running, he raised his hand in blessing, and the lion, rather than attacking, walked over and sat down next to him, and they shared a meal together in unlikely friendship. Now, at this time, King Merewelch was being troubled by dreadful dreams of doom and death, and when he got to hear of this extraordinary event, he realized that Eadfrith was a man of rare powers. So he invited him to his great hall and asked him for an interpretation of these dreams and visions. Eadfrith was able to assure him that all was well. These dreams were just warnings against his belief in the old ways, in the old gods. To find peace, he needed to convert to Christianity. So Merewelch did. He abandoned his pagan beliefs, his trust in the Saxon gods of Woden, Frigg and Thunor, and embraced the new modern religion. And to celebrate his newfound status, he built a church at the place where Eadfrith and the lion had sat down together in such companionship. And that's how the Priory came to be founded. So this has been a holy place of prayer and celebration for nearly 1400 years. The Priory was rededicated in 1123, and the town gradually grew up around what became a large and powerful monastery. And what survives of the great church today suggests that at its peak it was a really magnificent building, but that was before its dissolution at the hands of Henry VIII and his ministers in the 16th century. Like many other previously monastic towns, Malvern, Pershore and Tewkesbury amongst them, the people of Leominster were given the option of buying the church building itself for use as their parish church. But it was expensive, and it was far too large for the parish alone. But building materials were very valuable and scarce. The timber, the roof lead to building stone. So most of the monastic buildings were dismantled, the materials sold off and reused elsewhere. And the church itself lost its transepts, its chancel and lady chapel, so that now, rather oddly, the Priory is made up of a series of 4 naves, the large spaces for the people, for the congregation, rather than the religious celebrants. And they're varied, they're all built at different times, each very beautiful in its own way, with wonderful Norman and Gothic architecture. But when you're inside the church, the building just feels to me a bit of a box, really. There are none of the complex architectural elements that you'd expect to find in a building of such age and importance. But the church is full of incident and detail, with wonderful, intriguing, and often bizarre carvings, both inside and out, in stone and in wood. It's a little museum of eccentricity. There was a Herefordshire school of sculpture in the early Middle Ages, and the work of these extraordinary craftsmen is unique. It's extraordinary, full of wild imagery of sinuous, writhing forms, of strange beasts, grotesque figures, and complex interlacing patterns. And when you stand outside the west door of the Priory, you're confronted with carvings by the Herefordshire School of real richness, real imagination in the capitals of the columns. There are lions and biting serpents, fat, writhing fronds of vegetation almost engulfing the men who are hacking away at them with sickles. And these are not ordinary images. There's a feeling of ancient complexity to this work, with echoes of Celtic, of Viking and Saxon art all combining. And there's a kind of frisson of strangeness as you study them. And the same is true of the carvings on the capitals on the inside of the doorway. The most eye-catching, I think, is a green man, a summoning up of the spirit of wild nature, in the form of a carved head with fruiting foliage spilling almost painfully from his widened and gaping mouth. And, you know me and stained glass, I can't walk by without taking notice, and there is a glorious stained glass window in the Lady Chapel by Charles Eamer Kemp, one of a group of his works in the Priory. Now, Kemp's studio turned out huge numbers of windows in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. It was almost big business. But there is always enormous delicacy in his work, a sensitivity in line and detail. Everything is exquisitely drawn, beautifully made. Some of his windows, it has to be said, can be a little humdrum, a little formulaic. But this window is just fabulous. It's sumptuous and brilliantly coloured. This must be one of his best of the 1890s, with the Angel Gabriel's shimmering peacock feather wings. Kemp was a devout Christian. He had wanted to be a minister in the church, but was prevented by a profound and uncontrollable stammer. He found any form of public speaking impossible, so he decided to dedicate his skills as an artist. "If I'm not permitted to minister from the sanctuary," he wrote, "then I will use my talents to adorn it." And his work can be intellectually complex too. He was a great believer in the power of ideas in his art. And of course, stained glass windows are not just pictures, they're not just decoration. They have meaning and purpose within the context of their location in the church. And here we are standing in the Lady Chapel. It's the part of the church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the Mother of Jesus. And this window reinforces that idea. It celebrates one of the great moments of Mary's life, the announcement by the angel Gabriel that she is to bear the Son of God. Although, I must say, they both look pretty relaxed about it, considering the enormity of the news. And here Kemp is testing out ideas. He employs the idea of antitypes, the medieval belief that passages in the Old Testament of the Bible foreshadow events in the New. And in the small panels below the Annunciation, you can see the story of Moses and the burning bush, in which God speaks to Moses from the heart of a thorn bush. But the thorn bush is blazing with a bright fire. But while the thorn bush is burning fiercely, it is miraculously unconsumed. And this was taken as a symbolic companion to the Annunciation. It was a foreshadowing of Mary's purity. She bears God's Son, but without losing her virginity. Her purity is unchanged, just as the thorn bush is unchanged by the flames. Everything connects in the medieval imagination. And this little scene is treated with real sensity by Kemp, as Moses in a blue robe and red cloak stands in awe, his hands held up in astonishment as the fire blazes bright against the rich greens of the bush foliage and surrounding landscape. So, leaving the church and walking back from the Priory through Grange Court Park to the town centre, we passed Grange Court itself. This is a grand and elaborate black and white building. It was originally the main butter market, the main market hall, standing at the top of Broad Street in the town centre. And it's another 17th century tour de force built by John Abel in 1633. And we first met him in Ledbury back in episode 2. But here, this time, he was working in his hometown. And the building was dismantled in the 1840s so that they could widen the road. And it remained stacked up in a builder's yard until it was bought in 1859 and re-erected as a private house here in Priory Park. And this is one of Abel's grandest surviving works. But the great thing is that the house is now owned by the council. It's open to the public. You can go in, you can get up close and admire the beautiful internal timberwork. You can have a cup of tea and a piece of cake and enjoy what Leominster's Victorian citizens were prepared to throw away with such abandon. But there is one curiosity in town kept rather unexpectedly in the Priory Church rather than a museum. And that's the town's municipal ducking stool. It would have been old-fashioned even 200 or 300 years ago, so they're rare things now. I mean, the satisfaction of public outrage through crude ritual humiliation wasn't really considered appropriate or acceptable even back then. But not in Leominster, which performed the last recorded ducking in England in 1809. One evening, Mrs. Jenny Pipes was picked up in the street for making very public, loud, derogatory and crude remarks about her husband. And she was, unfortunately, a serial offender and so was brought before the town magistrates. But she was having none of that and started cursing and swearing at them, and that didn't really go down very well. So, tired of being abused and cross at having their dinner disturbed, they sentenced her to the ducking stool. So she was strapped onto the stool and wheeled through the town, while she maintained a constant barrage of abuse of the rapidly growing crowd. They were cheering and shouting, there was music playing, and this was serious public entertainment. And eventually everyone reached the little river Kenwater near where it flows into the Lug at the northern end of town. And to the crowd's cheers, she was dunked down into the water and came back up again, still pouring a torrent of filthy curses on Leominster and everyone in it. So they dunked her again, and she came back up even more foul-mouthed than before. And eventually people got bored. They gave up, went home, and Jenny was released, unrepentant. So I suppose she could claim to have won, to have beaten the system. Although what kind of a reception she got when she went home, we don't know, although her husband was probably part of the crowd. So, leaving a sodden and no doubt still furious Jenny Pipes behind, it's time to set out from Leominster, leaving town by Rylands Road and heading southwest towards the little village of Ivington. We leave the town quickly as handsome Victorian villas give way to rich arable country, the Rylands from which the road and Rydale sheep get their name. Rye growing was an important agriculture in Herefordshire. It was the basis of prosperity and good beer, and you can still see flocks of Rydale sheep in the region, especially on smaller mixed farms, although the breed itself almost disappeared entirely in the early 20th century. And they are the archetypal image of what we imagine sheep should look like. They're stocky and sturdy with tight curled fleeces. They're tough, quick, opinionated, and difficult to catch as well. We cross the River Arrow, which flows down from Hurgist and the Radnor Forest to join the Lug just south of Leominster, and coming into Ivington we turn right at the little Victorian church. Heading towards Dilwyn on this narrow road, we have joined the ancient web of tracks and lanes which bind this country together. These are roads which have been in use for hundreds, if not thousands of years, linking settlements, the route for drovers, for farmers, soldiers on the march, from church spire to church spire. Looking to the left across the fields, you can see Camp Hill, with the great multi-vallate Iron Age hill fort Ivington Camp above its western escarpment. And this is a great strategic position, dominating the open river valleys of the Lug and the Arrow. And some 2,000 years after it was originally built, it was again a stronghold amidst military action. We heard in the last episode of how the great Welsh leader Owen Glendower's forces camped here before sweeping down to sack Leominster, leaving it burned and ruined. 2 years later, an English army, led by a young Prince Henry later to become King Henry V, cleared the Welsh from their stronghold and liberated the town. It was a setback which really marked the turning point in Glendower's fortunes. Owen Glendower is a constant presence in our journey now as a leader, a hero, a fugitive, a legend, and these Marcher lands are soaked in his story and his history. And whether you're Welsh or not, it's impossible not to admire him and his achievement. His rebellion against English arrogance and injustice caught a popular mood and drew thousands to his cause. And between being elected Prince of Wales in 1400 and 1404, when he called the first Welsh Parliament in Machynlleth, he swept all before him, capturing castles, towns, whole regions throughout Wales and the Welsh marches. The English armies of the new king could do nothing. They were ambushed, they were harried, demoralised and defeated, until Prince Henry, already showing his brilliance as a military commander, forced the Welsh to leave Herefordshire. These fields and lanes were strewn with bodies of Welsh soldiers cut down as they streamed away westwards. And although the revolt continued for another 10 years, defeat here and at Grosmont, which is also on our journey, saw the tide begin to turn in English favour. In a couple of miles we crossed the A4110, another Roman road leading north to Bravonium and on to Wroxeter, the ruined city of Viriconium. Just to our right, the modern road bends away towards the village of Kingsland, but the Roman road still shows, straight and true, marked by farm tracks and field boundaries. In another mile or so we reach Dilwyn, passing a lovely old orchard on our right as we enter the village. Dilwyn is one of a group of villages along with Pembridge, Urdesland, Kingsland and Webley, characterised by their wonderful collections of 16th and 17th century half-timbered buildings, and known collectively as the Black and White Villages. As we discovered in Ledbury in episode 2, this style of building, so striking and dramatic in its own way, is typical of this idiosyncratic county, and Dilwyn is full of half-timbered cottages clustered around the village green and church. It's a charming place. It's also ancient. We follow the road as it drops down into the village and then turn right towards the Church of St. Mary. Here the road curves around the churchyard wall, the burial ground raised a good 6 feet above the level of the road, reinforcing the church's status as the great building at the heart of the community. And this is almost certainly an ancient holy site. The curved boundary suggests an early, perhaps Celtic site, as does the presence of ancient yews in the churchyard. Yew trees are difficult to age. They grow so slowly and erratically. Sometimes they drop into dormancy and then spring back to life years later. You can get a rough idea of age by the girth of the great trunks, and the larger of these two could be 700 or 800 years old, or maybe more than 1,000, predating the church by 300 years? Yew trees are associated in Celtic culture with death and resurrection, with extinction, rebirth and renewal, ideas which have permeated later cultures as well. And so they're valued in churchyards. They make links with Christianity and Christ's resurrection. So maybe this could be the site of an early Celtic Christian centre. We know that this area was at the heart of Celtic evangelism in the early days of Christianity in England, led by local saints such as St. Dyfrig, who was born in Madeley, just over the River Wye from here. Or perhaps it's even older, more ancient, and in tune with an earlier druidic and pagan life. In fact, perhaps this has been a holy place for thousands rather than hundreds of years, absorbed firstly into Celtic and then into Christian traditions, but communicating to us today from a distant prehistoric past. The church itself is beautiful. It's a grand and impressive building full of interest. But for me, Dilwyn's great claim to fame is musical. It was in Dilwyn that some of the most important work in the preservation of English folk song was begun. We heard of Mrs. Ella Leather in episode 4 and her role in the rescuing of English folklore in the early years of the 20th century. And she sought out stories from people with long memories of country life, of country traditions, stories, superstitions, the natural rhythms of life and the seasons. But she also collected songs and music which would have disappeared completely as the older singers died out. This was an oral tradition, handed down from one generation to the next, from one singer to the next. Sometimes the ballads were recorded on printed broadsheets sold at local markets, but usually nothing was written down, and it was Ella Leather who set out to capture as much of this extraordinary cultural legacy as she could. She sought out those who were known to be singers, many from the travelling communities who followed seasonal work around the county, all of the singers old now. And she would travel often alone around the area, helped by some of what was then the latest technology, recording songs on wax cylinders. Sometimes she was helped by fellow enthusiasts, but most often she travelled with her friend, the composer Ralph Vaughan Williams, who transcribed the music directly while Ella recorded the words as the songs were sung. And the names of the singers were always noted as well. I particularly love two of the songs recorded at Dilwyn, which were especially popular in their time. The ballad Cold Blows the Wind, or The Unquiet Grave, and the story of Dives and Lazarus. Cold Blows the Wind was sung by William Harrans, and it tells of the danger of excessive grief at the death of a loved one, because the grieving of a survivor can call the dead back from beyond the grave, dead and with death in their corpse breath. In the song, a young woman has cried for her dead lover for over a year, and her uncontained sorrow calls him reluctantly back from the cold earth. And all she wants is one last kiss. One kiss from thy lily-white lips, she sings. One kiss is all I crave. The cock doth crow, and we must part. I must return to my grave. If you have one kiss from my lily-white lips, your days will not be long. My lips are as cold as any clay, and my breath, it is earthy and strong. On another occasion, Mrs. Leather caught up with a famous singer, Mr. John Evans, just as he was leaving the Crown Inn, Dilwyn's lovely 17th century pub, and she persuaded him to stay on to sing his version of Dives and Lazarus, the story of the rich man and pauper from St. Luke's Gospel. Dives, or Diverus in Dilwyn, holds a great feast for all his friends and gentry of the best, but the only things he'll send out to poor Lazarus, starving in the street outside his great gates, are his dogs to lick Lazarus's sores. But when the end comes, as it fell out on a light dully day when Lazarus sickened and died, there came two angels out of heaven his soul for to guide. Arise, arise, brother Lazarus, and come along with we. There is a place provided in heaven for to sit on an angel's knee. But as it fell out on a dark dully day, when Diverus sickened and died, there came 2 serpents out of hell his soul for to guide. Arise, arise, brother Diverus, and come along with we. There is a place provided in hell for to sit on a serpent's knee. There is a place provided in hell for wicked men like thee. And that song was transcribed by Vaughan Williams to be worked up into one of his most beautiful folk works, the 5 variations on Dives and Lazarus. But now, as we come to the end of our episode, it's time to look west and south, to leave the River Arrow behind and cross up and over the first outliers of the Welsh hills, to drop down into the ancient landscapes of the Wye Valley. The English Journeys podcast is directed, produced and engineered by Mike Ellis. It's written and spoken by me, Martin Ellis, and we would love to have your company as we continue our journey in the next episode.